Today we're going to continue our learning of JavaScript, and today we're going to work on working with functions. We're going to learn how to use functions and pass variables into those functions, and then we're also going to learn how we think through designing a solution to a problem. How are we going to use functions and for loops and if statements to do all the functionality that a user would expect? And so to do that, we're going to use a simple image slider. The image slider will have text, it will have a forward and a back button, and little dots at the bottom that you should be able to control to move anywhere in the slideshow. So there are a lot of ways that you could do this, and we're going to use this slider as a way just to teach you how to work with sequential functions, where you go from one function to the other, as well as passing data into a function. So let's get started. The first thing I do is I want to plan out what do I want this to do. So here's the example we're going to be building today. It's a simple image slider that you click the button and it goes next from 2 to 3. When it gets to the end, it goes back to 1, and then if I hit the previous button, it goes back and it loops backwards, and then I have these nice little buttons, these little dots that change their state based on which version you're on. So a very simple slider. You've seen it in a lot of different places, and we're going to use this as an example to just learn how to use functions and how to be able to add that functionality that we want. My first step I always do is to work through and plan out what I'm going to do. So what is it that we need to code? What are the functions we might need? What's the user experience like? So I go through and I think through it. So on load, it needs to do X, Y, and Z. So in our case, on load, we need to hide all but the first slide, hide the text for the captions for everything but the first slide, and make sure that the buttons are on the page. Okay. And then when the user clicks next, they're going to fade out the current slide, fade in the next slide. When the user hits back, what is it going to do? And so I'll walk through this step. And so in our case, it's current slide, fade in the previous, and then when the user gets to the last slide and clicks next, it switches and goes back to the first one. Okay, so we want to make sure we do all of those things. And then one thing I sometimes do is I'll write my function names beside here. So I might call this init. You might have an init function. We're not going to do that in this case because we're just doing a very simple thing. But if you had lots of different items that needed to be initialized, you could do that. When they click next, so this might be next. Oops. Okay, you could have a function like that, and then you might have a function called previous slide. Okay, which as we build this, those could be right or wrong, but it helps us to think about how we might use that. Okay, so let's go ahead and open the files, the JS slider class start files that were provided on the class website. In those files, you're going to find an index file, a JS file, and a CSS file. I've gotten a lot of the content ready for you, so you can go in here and look at the HTML and see that we have 3 slides, and we define them by a div class of my slide or my slides, and each one of these has content in it. It has the numbers, it has the caption, and it has the actual image file, and all of those are available in the folder. So we have essentially 3 nodes. I've also provided the next, previous, and next buttons and the dots, and we'll get into what code we want to put in there on the onClick event a little bit later. So the first thing we need to do is, going back to our plan, our first thing we need to do is hide everything but the first slide. So I'm going to open this page as is, and if I refresh this page, what you see is when no JavaScript is loading here or doing anything, it just displays all the HTML right on the page. Okay, and so that's what you would expect it to do, and so what we need to do is to change that a little bit. So we're going to have a function to basically set the slides to be what we want. And I think we can do this in kind of one major function that we're going to call show slides. So let's create a function, call it show slides. Okay. And it's going to actually display these slides. Now, One of the things that we want to learn today is how we can pass information into it. So I can put a variable here in this particular function so that when I call the function later, like this, if I put a number in here, that number will now be the variable in. So if I do a console.log in, we will then see it equals 1. So we want to say which slide we want to show. So we're going to create a variable called slide index and set it to 1. And the reason we're going to set it to 1 is because we know the first picture, the second picture, the third picture. It's a little bit easier to work with when you think about it that way. Even though our array and our objects and everything will start at index of 0, if we use the slide index starting at 1, it makes things a little bit easier to think about as we're building this. But you could do it at 0 too as well. So in this case, now I'm going to pass it slide index. And it's going to be the same response, 1. Okay, so nothing changed there. Okay, so we have a function called show slides. Now the first thing we want to do is to make it so that all of those slides disappear. And so we can use the display property and set its style display of none. So CSS and JavaScript working together gives us the CSS API. And so we can set a particular node, and we could use this particular thing. So x equals display of none. But we need to select that thing first. So before we get into that, let's go ahead and select all of the slides from our page. Now, we're going to do this a little bit different than we have in the past. We're going to select all of the slides using the by class name rather than ID. So remember, IDs, there's can only be one on a page, but a class, there can be multiple on a page. And so what's nice about this is when I create this variable called slides, when I have multiple divs, multiple classes by this name, it will put them into an array, or more accurately, an object. So we'll now have an object called slides. So let's comment this out for a second, and then let's just console log slides, and let's see what we get. We get the HTML content, and there are 3 items. So the length of this object is 3. There are 3 different items, and you can drill down and get into all of the different nodes, and everything that is selected out of that. You can get its class name, its content. All of these things are available here in there. So we now have extracted out of the HTML all 3 of these nodes. Okay. So then we can now set it to hide. And so, as I was saying here, instead of doing it this way with setting it to X, what we'll do is we could do slides dot style dot display dot none. Okay, so if we refresh this, it did not work because slides as an object has all of these different properties, and the display property is not available to that. So we need to just select a single item in that. So if I did it by object, we'll just, oops, don't know how I did that, sorry. Bracket 1 and save it. You'll notice now there's only 2 pictures there. Okay, the second one was hidden. So if I do 0, same thing. Okay, so if we wanted to hide all of them, the best way to do that would be in a loop. Right? Anytime we're working with objects and arrays and we want to do it on multiple ones, chances are it's going to be solved by working in a loop. So we're going to create a for loop, and it will take and use the display property and set slides I. So each time through this loop, set its display to none. So if I save that, refresh it, now all my images have disappeared. Okay. So that was kind of the first part of our plan, to hide all of them. But my first part of my plan said all of them but the first one. Okay, and now I've hidden all of them. So what I want to do is then set it so that it'll display the first one. So if we use the display none, the opposite of that is display block. Okay. So what we're going to do is outside of this loop, but inside the function, we are going to set our slides to the slide index -1. So remember, it's the first slide, but the index is 0, so we're going to do index to get it to 0 and display the first one, and we're going to set it to display block. So now if I save this, refresh it, I do see the first one. Nothing else is working yet because we haven't built that part yet, but at least the first one is showing and everything else is hidden. Okay. So part 1 of our plan, these are done, and we do have the buttons on the page because we did that through HTML. So now let's work on what happens when you click next. Okay, so we have a button that we need to click. Well, in our HTML, we have a previous and next that have a click event. And so I'm going to try to do this in a single function, and we'll just call it plus slides. So whenever you click next, it will add 1. And whenever you click previous, it will subtract 1. Okay, and so we're going to pass that into the function, and we want to make sure we spell our function the exact same way. And so when we go to main.js, we're going to come in here and we're going to build our function. All right. Now, remember, we want to make sure that we receive that information. So we are sending in a 1 or a -1. We need to receive that, and the way we do that is all we need to do is put a variable in here, and you could use x, but I use n for number. Whenever I have a number coming in, I just typically use n. But you could make that more verbose so that you know what's coming, previous slide, something like that if you wanted to, or slide index. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say, run this show slides function, and we're going to do slide index plus equals whatever n is. So we're going to increment by 1, or in this case, not just increment by 1, we may subtract 1. So whatever -1 or +1, we will change our which one we want to actually be on, if that makes sense. So let's log this so you can see what's happening. We'll be verbose in our logging. Console.log inside I can't type, I'm sorry. So I'm inside this function. Now let's go ahead and put a log in here for not plus slides, but show slides. Now, when I refresh this page, you'll see I am inside the show slides with a value of 1, so I'm on the first one. Notice this function up here, plus slides, did not run. It should only run when I click it. It did, and it said plus slides with a value of 1, show slides with a value of 2. So I went from this function to this function, changing this number to 1 plus 1 to equal 2. Okay. So 1 plus 1 equals 2 going into the show slides function. Okay. Now if you think about it, could I have made that, a little bit more efficient? Yes, you could have gone directly to the show slides function and done some logic in there. I'm trying to make this as easy for you guys to see, and I want to show you how you can do sequential functions where one function calls the next function. So we have plus slides, and then if we do a minus sign, it should work. But oh no, when we got to 1 and we went down to 0, it tried to display a property style of none on something that didn't exist because there was no node 0. Okay, and so we need to figure out what to do there. So we need to reset it when it gets back to 0. Well, the best way to do that is to do an if statement. So if the current n is less than 1, we'll go ahead and set it. So after we've defined our slides, but before we do our logic here, we'll say if n is less than 1, go ahead and set the index to not what it equaled before, but whatever the length is. Okay, and so that'll put this at the end. So I said this is back at the beginning. This is actually the part that says that if it's 0, it sets it to the very end. And then if we want to actually do one that defines the sets it back to 1, we'll do a similar if statement. If n is greater than the number of slides we have in the array or the object, then go ahead and set it back to 1. So once we get to 4, set it back to 1. Okay. So now if I refresh this page, 2, 3, back to 1. And then let's do previous 3, 2, 1, back to 3. Okay, so this is working. Okay. And if you're having trouble grasping this and you want to see what's happening, just go ahead and put in another console. You know, something like that just tells you what's going on. Okay, and that can help you to see, you know, what's happening here. You know, inside the if shows up right here. Okay, so you can see when you get into certain functions by adding those logs. Those logs are not necessary, and you probably want to take them out before you turn it in or before you were to launch a project like that, but they can be helpful when you're developing. All right. So we have our next buttons and our previous buttons are working properly, but it's not fading yet, and we haven't changed our little dots to know which one we're on. So that was part of our plan, is we wanted to get the dots working. So let's go look at our index file here, and we have a span class. And so what we're going to do is let's do this with another function. So we're going to do it a little bit differently. We could make it into the same function, but this is just a good way of doing it as well. So we'll set this one to current slide equals 2 and 3. Okay. So I've created, or I need to create a function called current slide. So we have our plus slide function. Let's go ahead and do right below it current slide, and again we want to receive a variable from it. And in this case, we're going to do the same type of thing of getting the index here. So if someone presses on one of these little dots, we're going to take whichever one it is and set that to n, as we're going to say we can slide, show slides, and pass that number there. Okay. So just so we can see what's happening, we can do console.log equals, sorry. And these are all going to get confusing, so I'm going to go ahead and comment these out so we don't have so many to deal with. All right, so if I press this, I got that 1, I got a 2, and I got a 3. So we know this part's working, and then it's calling each function to send that number into our slideshow. So you see how these sequential functions, one leads to the next, one can pass information from one to the next. So you can do your processing in one, and then send that output to the other. Okay. So that gets us a good bit, but it doesn't get us the how do we highlight the one that we're on. So you remember we used the display block property when we initialized. Why don't we go ahead and do one for the dots? So we need to make sure we've selected the dots. And so that is, stand by, I gotta find my selector. Okay, right below slides, let's go ahead and define dots. So dots equals, get the class name, dot. Okay, so it's going to find all of the dots on the HTML. Previously used the display block property. Now we're able to use the class name property, and so we're going to just use the CSS API to change its class name to active. And so we can take the dots, select this particular dot that we want, and change it to active. Now that'll do it on the first one and get the first one right. But what we also want to do is make sure that we're getting each one for each slide that we happen to be on. So we're going to do that through an if statement. Sorry. We're going to do that through a for loop, not an if statement, a for loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of the dots, and whichever one we need to be on, we're going to change its state to active. So instead of just using it, we're going to actually replace the class name of active. So if I save this and refresh this page, you'll see I'm on the first one. So line 48 worked and gave index 0 or dot 0 the value that we wanted. And then if I click next, it highlights the gray and replaces the active to make sure it gets to the right one. Okay, so each one of those is applying it each time we go through the loop. Okay, so we have a JavaScript slider that loops around and goes forward and backwards. And so now the only thing that we didn't do that's part of our plan was we wanted it to fade. So we could use some JavaScript to do that, but the easiest way would be to do some CSS for this. So let's go to our main.css, and I've put in here the fade function for doing a fade animation in CSS. So let me show you what's going on. Because this is a fairly new functionality, it's not available as the same exact way of doing it for every browser. So we're going to have to do it in a couple of different ways for WebKit and other browsers. So, but the concept is the same in all of them. First, we create an animation name. And this is a name that's built into API. So you have fades and different tweens and things that you can choose to use. So we're going to use the fade animation. And then we set the duration, and I chose 1.5 seconds because I thought that kind of looked nice and smooth. It wasn't too short, it wasn't too long, and so you can set that particular duration. Now, this is something we add in just to make sure it works on all browsers, but you can set keyframes. So WebKit requires keyframes, and so we set its fade from an opacity of 0.4 all the way to an opacity of 1. So it's like 0 to 1. And so we basically control the way the fade looks. So this is one of those things that you're probably not going to write this from scratch. You might write this part from scratch, but you know, I kind of would go find a resource on doing CSS fading and copy and paste that in, and that's perfectly fine. So here, let's save that, and then we're going to go to our index, and then on our slides, we need to add the class fade. Okay, and it's called fade because that's what we called it in our CSS.fade. Okay, so save it, and now if we refresh this again, notice it faded in, and it fades each time we call that thing. So every time that gets displayed on the page, it's going to use that fade functionality that's coming from CSS. Okay. So we've taken this opportunity to use a slider to demonstrate how you're going to work with functions and how you're going to pass information to functions, and how to do sequential functions where one function calls the next function. So what I want you to do is to make sure you really understand what you're doing here. Walk through this code again, making sure you know what each line, each function, each for loop does. And if you feel comfortable with that, then you're ready to move on.